Welcome to today's Explainer. In our deeply interconnected world, we hear a lot about export-led growth being the absolute ultimate strategy for economic expansion. Today, that idea has practically universal acceptance. From primary commodities to manufactured goods and even services, nations both big and small are constantly orienting their economies to meet these massive global needs. But here's the reality of the situation. The international trade scene is a fiercely competitive world. Every single player is out there trying to undercut the other, employing every possible technique just to cultivate markets for their own products. So today, we're going to move quickly and unpack exactly how nations navigate this hyper-competitive environment and look at the systems they've built over time to keep global commerce flowing.
Okay, let's dive into our agenda. We'll be covering the basics of bilateral trade, expanding to multilateral trade, exploring free trade versus protectionism, looking at the role of GATT, and finally, enter the WTO.
Section 1. The Basics of Bilateral Trade. One-on-one exchange.
To start off, think of bilateral trade relations as a highly specific, carefully negotiated direct swap between literally just two parties. The contracting nations sit down and hammer out exactly what they want from each other. They stipulate the exact type of goods, the precise volume of each item to be imported and exported, and even map out the stage-wise timeframe for when these exchanges will actually happen. It's a completely one-on-one deal.
Now, to actually make this one-on-one agreement function in the real world, bilateral trade generally relies on three very specific mechanisms. First up, there's countertrade. This is essentially a massive national-level barter system where the volumes of different goods are fixed so that the net trade perfectly balances out. Second, we have a payments agreement. If things aren't perfectly bartered, this agreement stipulates the specific currency, usually a widely accepted hard currency that will be used as the medium of exchange. And finally, perhaps the cleverest trick for keeping trade flowing is swing credit. Basically, if trade between the two nations falls out of balance, the country with a deficit might be permitted to simply carry that deficit into the next accounting cycle. As long as the swing credit is in place, the nations are under absolutely no immediate financial pressure to balance their trade right then and there.
But as you might guess, bilateral trade comes with some very real inherent limitations. It completely restricts comparative advantage to an isolated little loop. Let's say country A is actually one of the most inefficient producers of a specific good on the global stage, but because it happens to have a slight advantage over country B, they trade anyway. Without the pressure of broader global competition, domestic producers have absolutely zero incentive to innovate. This lack of competition leads to a pretty inefficient, less than optimum use of a country's resources, which ultimately results in stunted market growth, lower trade volumes, and a complete failure to cultivate outside markets. Section 2. Expanding to multilateral trade, removing boundaries.
So, a multilateral trading system is an entirely different ballgame. Imagine moving from a private backroom bartering session into a massive, bustling global supermarket. Here, a large number of nations interact with each other all at once. The physical boundaries, at least as far as the transaction and movement of goods are concerned, are totally removed. Goods produced in country A don't just compete with country B anymore. They compete freely for the consumer's dollar against goods produced in literally any other country on Earth. And this comparison right here brilliantly illustrates the stark mechanical differences between the two systems. While bilateral trade restricts comparative advantage to that localized, sometimes really inefficient loop we talked about, the multilateral system takes a totally global view. The free trade model within a multilateral system assumes that all available resources worldwide are being put to their best possible use. Why? Simply because the absolute most efficient producers are the ones ruthlessly winning the market.
Section 3. Free trade versus protectionism, the economic debate.
Let's look at the actual economic debate here, starting with the merits of free trade. The arguments on this side of the scale focus heavily on efficiency. Free trade creates what we call static gains, which really just means countries benefit immediately by specializing in what they're naturally best at making. But it also creates dynamic gains over time. We're talking economies of scale, international investment, and the rapid transmission of new tech. Plus, it provides a vent for surplus commodities that might otherwise literally go to waste, all while allowing countries to import goods that relieve their own domestic production bottlenecks. Sometimes, let's face it, simply buying a foreign import is vastly more productive than trying to force your own domestic resources to make it from scratch. But on the other side of the scale, we have the arguments for protectionism. The source material outlines that the doctrine of free trade isn't always perfectly useful, especially for developing countries undergoing rapid structural changes. For them, long-term development is often way more important than short-term efficiency.
A major argument here is the infant industry concept. Basically, putting up trade barriers so a brand new domestic industry can reach its optimum size without being immediately crushed by massive, established foreign competitors. Protectionism also counters the real dangers of excessive specialization, which can frankly put an entire economy at the absolute mercy of outside market shocks. For some nations, achieving self-sufficiency for strategic reasons or pushing for industrialization at any price makes it worth deliberately placing barriers on the free flow of goods. Now, when a country actually decides to protect its markets, it uses specific instruments to do so. We can broadly divide these into two categories. First up are tariffs. These are the highly visible taxes or duties slapped directly onto imported goods. They deliberately raise the price of foreign items to discourage consumers from buying them, pushing them toward domestic substitutes instead. But then we have non-tariff barriers. These are the hidden restrictions. We're talking direct quotas that limit the sheer volume of imports, monetary restrictions where governments flat out deny the foreign exchange currency needed to buy those imports, or simply drowning importers in endless administrative red tape and customs delays. Both methods ultimately restrict trade, for sure, but one is a visible tax and the other is a hidden hurdle.
Section 4. The role of GATT, creating world order.
Following the devastatingly restrictive trade practices we saw during World War II, nations were desperate for a new system. Back in 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, an International Trade Organization, or ITO, was proposed. But those plans for the ITO actually failed. Instead, as a provisional measure, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, known as GATT, was concluded in Havana in 1947. And for decades, GATT served as the rulebook, progressively becoming more and more liberal through various negotiating rounds. This all culminated in the Uruguay Round in 1994, which finally paved the way for the modern World Trade Organization to launch in 1995.
Just think about this number for a second, 121. To really understand the immense importance of GATT, you just have to look at its scale. Even though it started as merely a provisional agreement, by April of 1995, GATT had grown to include 121 member countries. Together, those nations accounted for an astounding 90% of all world trade. So how did GATT hold this massive coalition together? Well, it relied on a few core principles. The overarching goal was always to raise standards of living and ensure full employment globally. But mechanically, its absolute cornerstone was the most favored nation principle. This meant that any trade concession a country gave to one member would automatically be extended to all other member countries. Really levels the playing field, right? GATT also heavily pushed countries to rely on visible tariffs rather than those hidden quotas if they felt they absolutely had to protect industries. And importantly, it provided a much-needed neutral forum for nations to sort out differences, actively discouraging them from launching destructive retaliatory actions against one another.
Section 5. Enter the WTO, the modern solution.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how the World Trade Organization completely changed the game. It isn't just a treaty or some passive forum. It functions as a highly active management consultant and watchdog for global trade. The WTO administers 28 complex agreements through various councils. Its economists actively monitor the pulse of the global economy. And crucially, it provides a streamlined, much tougher dispute settlement court packed with independent experts to ensure equal treatment and rule enforcement for all its trading partners. When we put them side by side, the WTO's upgrades over GATT become incredibly clear. GATT was primarily focused just on physical goods. It was heavily burdened by a rule requiring unanimous voting to levy penalties, which, let's be real, made enforcing rules virtually impossible. And its dispute resolutions were notoriously time-consuming. The WTO modernized all of this. It expanded the scope to include commercial services and intellectual property. It completely removed that impossible unanimous voting barrier, enforcing a strict 18-month maximum for dispute settlements. Plus, it operates on a one-country, one-vote principle, giving it a vastly more robust and fair operational structure.
And the financial stakes for getting this global system right are absolutely astronomical. It was estimated that the implementation and cooperation of the WTO, working alongside bodies like the World Bank and IMF, is likely to generate global income gains of up to $200 billion a year. That is a staggering economic reward for getting multilateral trade optimized. However, the source material does neutrally point out a significant caution regarding this WTO era. With new agreements covering intellectual property, investment measures, and services, the clout of massive multinational corporations, or MNCs, is expected to increase enormously. The concern evaluated here is that smaller developing nations risk becoming playthings to these powerful corporate entities. Now, while larger developing nations with massive home markets, like India and China, might have the leverage to get better deals, surviving in this environment relies heavily on the strength and integrity of individual governments. They absolutely must have the capacity to firmly implement anti-monopoly laws and promote fair competition against these multinational giants.
And this highlights the crux of modern global commerce. We've moved from simple bilateral bartering to an incredibly complex multilateral web overseen by the WTO. But as this system grows more efficient and lucrative, it leaves us with a vital question to ponder. In a globally managed trading system, how will developing countries successfully navigate the rapidly increasing clout of these massive multinational corporations? It really is the defining economic balancing act of our time. Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity to learn even more.